Okay. I think I will make a start now. Hopefully Nikki will be able to join in just in time for her introduction. So welcome everyone. This is the roundtable on how the NIHR surgical MIC can support you. So in my initial introduction, I just sort of literally just grazed over the top of a lot of the things that we do. And one of the things we wanted to explore more in this session is looking at the methodology side and also looking at adoption and translation as well in terms of how we link into the different elements. So I'm going to ask our speakers to introduce themselves, and then they will give a brief overview of the work that they do. There might be one or two examples and case studies thrown in there. And if you've got any questions, then please start adding them into the Q&A session, which is to the right of the screen. So you should see chat and Q&A. Please click on Q&A because that allows people to actually respond to your questions as well in writing, whereas in the chat function, it can get lost. And then there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussions, hopefully at the end. So I'll ask our speakers to introduce themselves in the order that they appear on my screen. So Deborah, you go first.
Am I unmuted? Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Brilliant. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Deborah Stocken. I'm Professor of Clinical Trials Research and Head of Statistics at the Leeds Surgical Trial Centre, and I form part of the management team. I sit as a member of the management team on the Leeds Surgical MedTech Co-operative Management Group. So as a trials unit, a bit about what I do, a bit as a trials unit, we're interested in the evaluation of new interventions and through a pathway of research from looking at the early stage initial efficacy of an intervention through to the late stage effectiveness through those multi-center pragmatic large and costly clinical trials. And what we're aiming to do in the clinical trials unit is change practice, essentially. So we want to be identifying early ineffective treatments that we can then stop the research pathway and look at where those interventions are working, modify, reevaluate, and then hopefully get them back into the research pathway. And we're obviously also wanting to identify effective interventions, and we want to identify those early so that we can streamline them as best we can through that research pathway and into patient care as quickly as possible. So as a trials unit, we have an obligation to make sure that we're evidencing that effectiveness robustly and that we're conducting our research as efficiently as possible. And it's important that by the time we get to the end of our research pathway, that we really know and we really understand why an intervention works, how it works, who it works in, and equally just as important, why an intervention doesn't work, so that we're able to learn from that and we're able to then take that research and put that intervention back into modification. So we want effective interventions to obviously be able to change practice, but we also need to understand, as part of that research pathway, very early on, the barriers. And I think the barriers come in predominantly two forms. Firstly, in developing that evidence to change practice through that clinical trial, understanding barriers to the clinical trial, to recruitment, to the delivery of that trial is really important to us. So we try to do that very early on in the research pathway. And the second barrier is at the end of the clinical trial, making sure that we understand any barriers to adoption and implementation. So what we need to understand very early on is the level of evidence that the clinical community and the patients need to see to justify changing practice, so that our clinical trials pathway delivers that evidence that people need to see to make sure that practice does change. So part of that leads me into who we are. So we are, as a clinical trials unit, a multidisciplinary team of methodologists, and our trials are designed with these multidisciplinary methodologists as well as delivered. And one of our methodologists, a really important aspect of our trials and understanding those barriers, is qualitative research and qualitative researchers. So it's quite timely that I hand on to Nikki, but I just don't think Nikki's on the line yet, is she? So maybe I won't be handing on to Nikki yet, but I will be handing on to Nikki to talk through the role of qualitative research in clinical trials. So I'll hand back to you, V, because Vicky's not here.
Yeah, okay. No, we'll come back. Yeah, we'll get back when Nikki's there. We'll try and sort her out. But Armando?
Yeah, so my name is Armando Vargas Palacios. I'm a senior research fellow in health economics in the academic unit of health economics. So I will be talking about, after the introductions, about what is health economics and how can be used for medtech and new technologies, how, when, and why we should use it. What can we offer as well as a unit? So the unit, I will probably leave David Meads to introduce more about the unit and the work we do, but we work along with the clinical trials unit as well. We do alongside clinical trials economic evaluations, but we also have a large portfolio of diagnostics, economic evaluation of diagnostic tests and medtech, new technologies, medical devices, AI algorithms, and all of that. So my particular interest and my particular role is on, I like more doing model-based economic evaluations, exploring new methodologies in order to capture all the potential benefits of a new intervention, a new medical device, an AI technology, for example, using innovative cost-effectiveness modeling techniques. So, yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. David Brettel.
Hi, B. Thank you. So good morning, everybody. David Brettel. I'm the Trust Chief Scientific Officer for Leeds Teaching Hospitals. I have a great job because I lead on innovation, technology, and all the exciting things for the new hospitals we're building in Leeds, opening in 2026. We have 2 new hospitals we're building. So my primary role at the moment is addressing all issues around innovation, evaluation of equipment, changing the culture of innovation amongst the workforce, networking amongst our partners, and basically making getting the best innovation, best technology into the hospital for our new hospitals, which we're going to open. Main platform for doing this at the moment is what we call the Innovation Pop-Up. The Innovation Pop-Up is a slightly disruptive idea to engage with staff, an agile solution, and I have some slides in a minute to show you what we've been doing. So thank you very much.
Great. And David Meads.
Yeah, morning all. David Meads, I'm an Associate Professor in Health Economics at the University of Leeds, and I think Armando's done a good job of introducing the type of work we do in our unit. With Armando, we lead the health economics work stream for the surgical MIC, NIHR surgical MIC. I sit on a NICE technology appraisal committee evaluating every month which treatments should be funded on the NHS, and I sit on an NIHR program grants funding panel. I think that's probably enough for now.
Okay. All right, thank you. So I think we'll go straight into sort of your particular areas in more detail. So we're starting off with health economics. So Armando, you're going to sort of give us a 3-minute talk about health economics, early modeling, and basically what it can do for medtech in terms of AI and sort of the digital world. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so yes, I mentioned before, so what I want is not a lot of time, but I'm just trying to be a bit concise on what's health economics, and what can we do for new technologies and for any of the companies interested on new developers. So health economics is via what we call economic evaluation, is a tool that allow decision makers or technology developers to determine the economic value of an intervention, medical device, new technology, AI. In the UK, is used to support recommendations or detect mandates on how or on to use certain type of methodologies, technologies, medications, etc., to provide health to the patients, to the healthcare, to the population. So that's like the basic idea of what we do. So we do economic evaluations of different technologies to evaluate its potential economic value. So I'm further to that, I'm going to say what economic evaluation or we don't do. So we don't provide a costing exercise. It's not aimed to save money to the NHS or to estimate like a breaking point down the line of a medical technology. So what we do is a comparative analysis of 2 or more interventions in terms of costs and outcomes. And for costs, we refer to all the costs, not only those related to the medical device or new technology, but also those of the consequences, positive or negative, like if using an intervention would create an adverse event, for example, we include all those costs, or also unexpected benefits. And in terms of outcomes, we use a unit of measure that's called utilities, a measure of welfare, a population-based unit of well-being, to construct what we call quality of life, or QALYs. When we combine these 2 elements, we determine what we call an incremental cost-effectiveness ratio. It's just a simple subtraction between costs and outcomes of 2 or more interventions, and determine via a predefined threshold value which intervention is cost-effective. So economic evaluation can be developed at different stages during the life of a new technology. It can be very early stages, when it's even in a prototype stage, when it's ready to be commercialized, or when it's already out there and needs to be introduced into the NHS market, for example. It can also be developed, obviously, along a clinical trial. But usually, when we're talking about new technologies, AI technologies, new developments, new medical devices, it usually comes at the early stages of the development. And this is important here because we, apart from being able to estimate the potential cost-effectiveness value or the potential economic value of the new technology, we can help estimate the maximum reimbursable price that the NHS will be willing to pay, given the technology, given the potential benefits of the technology, or what we call a headroom value. Obviously, this will allow you or the companies or the developers to determine if the technology is actually worthwhile, if the technology is actually worthwhile, continue investment, continue its development, because it will give you like a headroom value, how much the NHS is willing to pay for it, and if that makes sense to all of the costs that are involved in the development phase. Obviously, we as a unit, we can give from simple advice on health economics to a more obviously develop an economic evaluation analysis at any of the stages I mentioned before. And we can also help design and conduct, obviously, an economic evaluation component of a project or a funding bid. We have worked on, for example, a few years ago, I worked on a new laparoscopic device. It was in very early stages, and the objective for an eye-for-eye funding bid, and that was the aim of that project, was to estimate the maximum reimbursable price of the device for using the NHS. So we were able to estimate how much the company will be able to sell their product to the NHS and maintain its cost effectiveness. We also have been collaborating in several AI proposals of late. So, for example, AI software which helped triage patients for surgery in rheumatology. So that pretty much help medical personnel, surgeons, to determine if the patient can wait or if there's an unnecessary surgery, and then speed up the process, reduce waiting times. So we will be happy to answer any questions, and we have a poll as well that we are going to do in a bit during the conversations to see what ask you some simple questions about what you think is needed for a health economic evaluation, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Armando. And the poll's actually running on the main stage, I think, of the event. So a few people have responded to that. But if you haven't seen that poll, then please do go, because we are looking at developing this a bit more and making it more accessible, I think, to medtech developers. But thanks, Armando. And I think the main take home for me anyway from this point is obviously the earlier the better, so that we're not wasting a lot of money and then finding out something's not going to be worth it. We'll come back to some questions later on. But Deborah, this sort of links in well with the clinical trials aspect of it, because not a lot of companies think about contacting clinical trials and getting clinical trials methodology advice at such an early stage. The main thing people tend to do is do it right at the end. They've got their prototype, they've developed a few sample kits, and they're more or less just ready. They've got maybe their CECA marking, and they just really want to push it out to market. But can you tell us a bit about some of the challenges for medtech companies, especially when it comes to methodology, and how incorporating methodology sooner will actually support them get their device or technology out into the healthcare sector?
Yeah, so thanks, Faye. It sort of ties into my introduction about really trying to understand, I think, what we want at the end of the research pathway is to understand why something's worked fully, and understand why, if it hasn't worked, what components of that intervention have caused it to fail. Were there any components that actually were successful? And we should be focusing on those. And we need to understand that far earlier in the clinical trials kind of research pathway. So it's probably worthwhile just me taking a step back and just showing a little bit about how we plan the research pathway. I think the understanding the research pathway is really important, and the process that we go through in a clinical trials pathway is really important. And I think sometimes there's an uncertainty there about what our kind of process looks like. So we want to really engage quite early. There are steps in surgical trials and surgical device evaluation. There are frameworks that are out there to set the scene of how we look at something early phase and make decisions around the technical ability and make decisions around safety of that intervention in maybe say smaller number of patients and a smaller number of centres before we then move into a more multi-centre, maybe still early phase, but looking at levels of activity and looking at potential benefits in terms of clinical and patient outcomes, to then make an assessment about whether we should move then again along the research pathway into that very final definitive multi-centre randomised clinical trial. So what we don't want to be doing is taking a new intervention straight to a multi-centre pragmatic definitive trial, because that just may not be the most efficient process, and those trials at the end of the research pathway can be very long and can be very expensive. So we do have a framework for intervention evaluation. It starts quite in the early stages. Those early stage studies, they might be a single arm study. So a lot of it falls down to the phase of the study, so early or late phase, and it falls down to the design of the study, the statistical design of the study. And the statistical design that we think is most appropriate then helps us identify the parameters and the number of patients that you might need to be able to justify moving down that research pathway. So what we're trying to do in the early stages is not design a study around a hypothesis test for, clinical effectiveness. We're trying to use methodologies that say, is there enough information now? Is there enough evidence to justify moving to next step? And that's often not based on a p-value or a statistical test. It's based on a different kind of methodology. So what we want to do in the early stages is use appropriate early stage statistical methodology to provide enough evidence to be able to move down the research pathway in terms of outcomes, and monitoring safety and understanding the technical ability of the intervention as we go. So that early stage intervention might be a single arm, it might be a single centre evaluation, it may be a randomised intervention with maybe 1 or 2 sites, but the control arm in that sense is not necessarily, it's providing a benchmark rather than providing an absolute kind of statistical comparator. And then once we've moved down the early stage pathway into a late phase evaluation, then the things that we're starting to think about then are, how do we protocolize that intervention for taking it multi-centre? So understanding the variability in practice, understanding surgeons are different, understanding sites are different, understanding patient pathways at each of those sites nationally will be different and will have an impact. So what are the parts of that new intervention that have to be mandated to be then called that intervention, and which parts of that can we be a bit more flexible about? And we need that to be an evidence-based piece of work. So we're trying to understand what the protocol looks like for that intervention so that we can roll it out multi-centre. We need to understand learning curves. The early stage work, it helps us understand how long it takes to get that intervention up to speed in practice in an NHS environment. So there might be a real training package. There might be a learning curve of the user that we need to understand and we need to incorporate into that late phase evaluation. So that's a really important point. We understand sites are different, so surgeons are and clinicians are often clustered quite similarly in different sites, and that can then have an impact on the evaluation of an intervention. So understanding where there are clustering effects and making sure that we use the right designs to acknowledge that clustering effect in the design, and hence we get a robust analysis at the end. And then, as I said in my introduction, understanding deliverability. We are only ever going to have the evidence to potentially change practice if we can deliver that late phase study. So understanding what those barriers are for recruitment. There's a whole methodology that I think Nikki's really struggling to join. She managed to join the test yesterday, but I think there's been a glitch in the IT. But what Nikki would share with you is her, as a qualitative researcher based in the trials unit, a mixed methods researcher, she's really involved in understanding interventions that help recruitment of patients in that multi-centre late phase space, and help the clinicians to understand research and understand trials to then help the recruitment process. Understanding equipoise. We might not have individual clinicians at equipoise at that point, but as long as we have a community equipoise and there is an equipoise at that national level and a desire to answer the question, then there are different designs that we can implement to allow individual clinicians who may not be in equipoise still the ability to recruit their patients. And that's really important because our trials have to be generalizable, they have to be inclusive, so we have to have the clinical teams on board so that the patients have got access to that research. Otherwise we're not being inclusive. So there are different designs that we can utilize to make sure that we are doing that properly. So we are an academic unit, so we are academic statisticians. Nikki, as our university academic fellow, is an academic. So we are an academic unit that are involved in the whole process. So we are involved in the statistical design, the trial design. We're involved in the delivery of that research, and we're involved in the analysis and the dissemination of that research. So just an example of the types of studies that we have on the portfolio. We've got a real range on the Surgical Trial Centre portfolio, from charity funded early phase, single centre, sometimes 1 or 2 centre, early stage studies, which are really looking at refining and looking at levels of activity to justify moving on to the next stage of research. So we've got a couple of charity funded studies in that space. We have RFPB, so that's not NIHR, Research for Patient Benefit funded studies, which are looking at the feasibility aspect. So once we think we're ready to go into that kind of pragmatic multi-centre trial, shall we just try it out and make sure we can recruit and make sure we can see the patients at the time we need to, make sure we can deliver that intervention according to that protocol that we've developed. So there's a real feasibility aspect. So we often have standalone feasibility studies that are generally funded by RFPB. We have studies that are funded by the EME board, which is the Evaluation and Mechanistic Evaluation Board for NIHR, and they have funded a rolling phase 2, phase 3 seamless study, where we're looking at mechanisms of action in the phase 2 space. And if we tick the box and understand what that mechanism of action is, we can roll straight into the phase 3. And that's really efficient because the patients who are contributing to the mechanistic component also contribute to the late phase component because we follow them up long term. So that's a really efficient design, but it's a big commitment from EME because they're supporting early phase and late stage. So there's a commitment from funders there, which is often quite difficult. And then the majority of our late phase, sorry?
1 more minute and then
I'm done. The late phase portfolio is generally, by the time we get to that definitive multi-centre pragmatic trial, we're generally going somewhere like NIHR, HTA to be able to fund those. And they fund internal pilot phases as part of that study, and that's where the qualitative research has a real role. So we often have a 12-month roll-in and a big mixed methods research aspect to understand how that intervention is being used in practice and how we can roll that out at the end of the trial if that intervention looks effective. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, so that's definitely a lot to think about. And I think in terms of the research pathway, that's very important. That's something we try and sort of highlight within the surgical MIC to get people to think about where their device or technology actually fits in within that pathway. It's not just about a disease or a condition. It's got to fit in within that pathway. And David Brettel, then I guess this is where you guys would then come in, because you live and work within that environment where you've got the clinical pathways. You know exactly what the hospital wants. You know the bottlenecks, and you know where the opportunities are. So could you just tell us a bit about the innovation pop-up and how it sort of supports eventually bringing in those medtech to medical technologies into practice?
Thanks, V. Hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yep.
Fantastic. The innovation pop-up is it's a new initiative. It's only been going. It was officially launched in September, actually, but this is a hospital-led initiative, really, to, like I say, engage with staff and our partners and commercial companies around taking forward innovation in the NHS. And I think we need to recognise what the drivers are for this. And the first driver for us is the project we have undergoing at the moment called Building the Leeds Way, which is effectively a catalyst for NHS innovation, as far as I'm concerned. This is part of the New Hospitals Programme, a plan nationally to build 48 new hospitals by 2030, with around £2.5 billion of funding. We're very fortunate. We're effectively the Vanguard Hospital. We're the first hospital in wave 1, or hospitals, because we're actually building 2 hospitals. We're building a general adult hospital, and we're building a children's hospital. And you can see the architect concept drawing on the right there. And interestingly, that's based around a Henry Moore sculpture. So for those who are interested in architecture. but it's huge. It's I think it's about 14 stories high, 94,000 square meters, which is huge. And also importantly, at the end of this project, there will be 5 hectares of development space on our campus when we repatriate some of the buildings we're moving out of for redevelopment. And we're currently looking at innovation as being one of the key, health tech innovation has been one of the key development areas on that site. Other drivers, well, the national New Hospitals Programme sets a project delivery scorecard for all those hospitals involved in the programme. And you can see I've highlighted it in green there, some of the key drivers for what we're doing: intelligent hospitals, digital, emerging technologies, digital innovation. Digital is the key word, but for me, digital is many things, including health tech. A real drive for sustainability and net zero carbon technology and health tech innovation has a real big part to play in that as well. And also to drive economic benefits. This is around regional development and economic benefits as well. So the pop-up tries to address many of the issues that we've identified as, if you like, blockers to this activity. And the first is to allow us to centralize identification, evaluation, implementation of new technologies and innovations as appropriate. And this is a two-way process. This may be ideation, or it may be adoption and translation. We also need to create this culture of innovation. We have a significant workforce in Leeds. I think it's getting close to 20,000 staff. And to be honest, we've not been very engaged in innovation. Research, absolutely. We have a whole industry around research, but innovation, not so much. So we need to develop that culture so that when we open the new hospitals, we're both able and engaged to use those two new technologies, and also to develop our clinical talent. I think also importantly, we need to create a track record of credibility for investment in the innovation village in 2026 when we do that site redevelopment. I think that's really important. So sort of 3 key themes for the pop-up. So this is the pop-up, a nice little tagline there: supporting innovation, ideation, adoption and translation from an NHS setting for patient and staff benefit. The top picture shows the entrance to the Gilbert Scott building of Leeds General Infirmary. I mean, crikey, what an entrance. You wouldn't get a better front door to an innovation centre anywhere. And that is my front door. The buildings, the rooms below, the one on the left is the old boardroom for the hospital. And that is now the expo room for the pop-up. So we can bring in technologies, we can demonstrate them, and we can do workshops, etc., with staff in there. And on the right is the hub space, which is both hot desk, coffee space, a cafe culture, but also we have a resident in there who are permanently based in the pop-up currently. We're running on a membership model. We've got to be sustainable. We've got to be sustainable for a number of years. So the idea is that we're working with companies and staff to create this sort of membership offering. So we do offer services, we do offer support. We're increasing our portfolio of offering as well. But there is a membership to join as well. You need to become a member of the pop-up, and part of that is around a sort of code of conduct as well, to make sure that everybody is engaged with our values in the hospital and what we're trying to achieve. And that seems to be going really well at the moment. I think for me, really, what we're doing is making a soft landing in the NHS, and this is something that's often cited at us is difficulty in accessing the NHS by medtech and health tech companies. So we provide that soft landing, not just for industry, but also for our partners, for our academic colleagues. Come and have a coffee in a pop-up. It's there for you to come hang your coat up, put your sandwiches in the fridge, and be a home base for you. And I think that's really important, that people feel comfortable working within the NHS setting. We're hoping to connect regionally, nationally, internationally, and we are connected in all those areas, and that's going to grow. And I think it's important to recognise this NHS setting, near patients and clinicians, which is, I guess, our unique selling point. So we've not been going long, 100 days or so. We've got 10 company members signed up. Actually, we've got more than that now, and more in the pipeline. We've got 7 strategic partners and more coming. We've got a resident company, 40+ staff members, 4 cooperative projects underway and in development. We've got program activities ranging from an innovation club to demonstrating technologies. We're looking also at virtual education delivery for the new hospitals. And actually, we've made £11,000, which isn't a lot of money, but it's better than what we had before. So that's my entire budget for innovation in an entire hospital. So here we have our first 10 members, and I think it's really exciting to see a range both of technologies, of companies, of the stage they're at. But actually, many of these companies are international companies as well, who are working with us, some from Norway, Switzerland, Israel. We've also got local companies. Brandon Medical is a big or a regional company in surgical fit out of theatres. They're one of our newest members. And of course, LifePrints, 3D LifePrints, who do 3D printing for surgical planning, they're our first resident, because they need to be near to clinicians and patients to do what they do. We also have our first strategic partners, and you can see there, of course, the surgical MIC is part of that, as is the HSN, the lab, and also some other more specific areas as well. So we're really doing well, I think, in our positioning. And that position is really important, because I think we need to recognise where we add value. And I guess we add value because in some respects, in health tech, all roads will inevitably lead to clinicians and patients. So we have that sort of unique position where we can network and facilitate across all parties. So I've put us sort of at the centre, but I don't see us as a centre. I see us almost at the end of the health tech journey. But because of that, we're very well connected. And also, as you can see, we've got a key stakeholder in the new hospitals, as I say, in the catalyst. But actually, we've got the support of the NHS staff and other partners and our wider innovation ecosystem. So this is my last slide to just show you some real world activity in the pop-up. This literally happened the other day. It was unplanned. One of my colleagues just saw this activity taking place. And this is a 3D print of a distal femoral osteotomy, which is basically reshaping the bones. This is a real patient, well, simulation of a real patient. And what's really exciting is this is a very difficult operation. And this planning ended up in the surgeons changing their surgical plan. So this is really exciting to see this real world health tech and medtech innovation taking place. So if you want to find out about us, there's a couple of email addresses there. But actually, I tested earlier, if you put innovation pop-up in to Google, we're the top hit. So feel free to find us and get in touch. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. And yeah, we're certainly excited to be part of that. And I know we've shoehorned a couple of companies your way already, so hopefully that will come through. So I guess just to sort of start off on the questions, one of the things that we always get all the time is we're constantly being asked to do pilot studies by the NHS and everybody else. So I guess this question really does apply to, all the, units represented. Yeah, how can companies avoid death by pilot studies? Anyone want to go first? Deborah?
I don't mind coming in first. I'd question the terminology. I think pilot and feasibility work is really, the definition is really broad. Mm-hmm. And often what people are wanting isn't necessarily pilot, it's actually early indicators. Pilot feasibility work is often around, can we feasibly do this? Early indicators of activity are slightly different, and I think they get tied into the same thing. I think what industry want are early indicators, and that makes sense that it's actually early stage research. It's not really pilot or feasibility, it's more early stage research. And I think we maybe need to understand that better. And then the methods are there, the statistical methods there, but I think in the surgical and device space, we use them less. We use them a lot in drug trials. They're quite common. They're quite commonplace, but we use them less in the surgical space. So that's why the engagement with statisticians who know the early stage methodology, could really help. Yeah. But we want to know what the next step is. You can't come with a question about an early phase trial. That there has to be, where does it fit in the pathway? So if we show this, what are you planning to move to? So it's not about designing the next stage, it's just understanding where you're trying to get through so that we can deliver the right evidence to allow you to get there.
All right, yeah, thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer. Any thoughts from the health economics or from David, Brettel?
Thanks, V. We've spoken to many companies, and one thing they tell us is a real problem is in the NHS, when they want to translate some innovation, the real challenge is that all hospitals want to evaluate it themselves, all 500 of them in the NHS. So one of their sort of appeals really is this can be done once. So one thing we're trying to influence is that sort of, if you like, a process where a hospital can follow a protocol, and as long as that's methodologically sound, then other hospitals should support that piece of work, and that would reduce that burden on companies, which in some cases is financially crippling for them. So I think that's what we're hoping we can influence.
Yeah, and yeah, that's a very important point, as every hospital wants things done their way. But I think that's the right way to go, is if all hospitals have got an agreed methodology on something, then once one hospital does that, why should everybody else repeat that? David Meads, I'll bring you in, Deborah, but David Meads.
Well, yeah, just to say, I guess that many innovations will never get to trial, and they'll never, regardless of how effective they are or cost effective, a trial is probably not the way to go for them. So more and more we're moving towards a model of providing earlier access to innovations and collecting evidence, real world evidence, and reevaluating those innovations. And that's very clear, and it's in NICE's 5-year strategy to do that. More managed access. And as Deborah said, that's going to need different statistical techniques, which allow you to do causal inference when you're not, running a randomized trial. But running and collecting data in just a few centres with small numbers, might be as far as data collection gets at the beginning for some companies, but that doesn't prevent some indications of benefit. And certainly in terms of generating your value proposition, that's not a barrier at all. So using techniques such as early modeling frameworks, you can generate a value proposition based on actually very limited data. So I don't think, terminology is important, but pilot studies are not necessarily the death knell for in many cases.
Cool. Thank you, Deborah. You want to come back in?
Yeah, it was just to emphasize actually, what David said. Early phase work doesn't need to be a randomized controlled trial. I think when people think about trials, they think about a randomized controlled trial, and there is a framework of early stage work which may be single arm. You don't necessarily need to have a randomized comparator in that early stage, and I think understanding that is really important. I think the most important thing for me is that it's statistically sound. What you don't want is, just a random couple of patients from a couple of hospitals. The other thing I was going to say, just in response to David, was understanding what that getting a consensus for the protocol. So there will be parts of an intervention that can be variable at site and that make no impact on the clinical outcome, the patient outcome, and so allow those to be variable. It needs to fit in with practice, but we need to understand which parts of the intervention are really key to get right and protocolize those and share that protocol and come up to it with a consensus, across the clinical community that can be delivered before you even start to recruit patients, because that's what you need. You need that protocol to be adhered to, the protocolized bits to be adhered to.
Yeah, sure. Armando?
And yeah, just to add to David Smith's comments, we can develop early economic evaluations using experts' opinion or expert elicitation panels. So we can develop economic evaluation with very little information, and we can estimate a potential economic value of the technology, even when the device is just at development stages, when there's nothing, rather than just what the developer thinks and the experts and the surgeons think that the benefit will be.
Yeah, no, that was the question I was going to ask, is sort of what data do people need? But if you're saying you sort of work with what you have and then you come up with something suitable, then that, at least for companies, that means they don't have to sort of lose sleep thinking about they need to be at a certain stage of the process before they can actually access your support and your advice, because then it might be a bit too late by then. which sort of leads into sort of the, the MedTech funding mandate, is how does that all fit in, health economics fit into that funding mandate, the MedTech funding mandate?
Shall I? I'll take that one. Yeah, so the NIHR's approach to the assessment of medical technologies is in the main slightly different to that of pharmaceuticals, because there's an expectation that medtech is going to be cost neutral or cost saving, and so most of the assessments, the medtech innovations that go through the MTEP process at NICE, there's an expectation there's cost savings there. But the problem with that assessment process is it's not mandatory in terms of the funding decision. So whereas the technology appraisal process is, so when a drug is approved through the appraisal committee, it has to be available on the NHS within 3 months, and that has never been the case for most medtech going through the NICE process. And companies self-elect to go through the MTEP process. The funding mandate is aiming to change that, because up to now, the implementation of medtech, which gets a positive recommendation through NICE, has been quite low. What the funding mandate does, and it was released this year, is to select a bunch of innovations each year which get a positive recommendation through the MTEP process, i.e. they're expected to be cost saving within the first three years, and they've got to save £1 million in the first 3 years, I think. It aims to implement those to reduce implementation barriers, get procurement processes going, get the academic health science networks implementing those. So this year in April, I think there were 4 new technologies that got a positive MTEP approval. They went into the MedTech funding mandate, and those are being pushed now through the NHS through several routes. And one of them is a handheld device called GammaCore for treating cluster headaches. And there could be 11,000 patients who would benefit from that, and that mandate rolled out in April this year. And we're still to see what the impact is, but the hope is that this mandate will increase the uptake of these cost-saving devices.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that's a question we always get asked. I mean, we sort of a bit removed from the whole mandate side of things, but it's useful to understand how that actually works. So just to sort of round up, I think, is another question that medtech companies often come up with is, where do we get the funding to interact with you guys? Do we need funding? How much funding do we need? Where can we get funding? So that's always a big question. And looking at the poll results earlier on, I think funding seems to be a big one in terms of accessing sort of services. So Deborah, you look like you're ready to go with an answer.
Oh, I think I'm already off mute. Sorry if I was noisy. I was writing. It always comes down to money, doesn't it? I think there are funding streams out there. So, there are NIHR funding schemes, the I4I funding scheme that's available for, medtech innovation. It's difficult. I think it is difficult. But I think if you think about the research pathway and think about the steps, actually some of those earlier steps don't require, big multi-center pieces of work. I think it's making sure that you've got your first step and you know what you need to answer to tick the box to move on to the next step. A funding panel will always look at the existing evidence. So I think starting to build up the evidence base, around safety, around technical ability, moving into kind of more feasibility. There are other pots of money, to be able to do those smaller pieces of work to start collating the evidence, and then the bigger pools of money that you need for the bigger projects later downstream. You'll be more successful because you'll have that background information.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, thanks, Fee and Deborah. Yeah, I guess I think the first thing to say is that for folks who are thinking about building an economic case, they can get advice first and foremost. So they can, through the surgical MIC, through the NIHR RDS research design service, they can come and talk to health economists to talk about, where the value might be in their particular innovation and what evidence they need. So there are routes there for those early discussions. And David, Brettel, I would just say, I mean, we could buddy up with you and we could offer an advice clinic to the pop-up. We could advertise that, and we could be there one day to give advice to companies coming in. I'd be quite happy to do that. But that's getting to talk to us first and foremost. So then, in terms of funding, we've had quite a bit of success with NIHR I4I Connect, which I think the funding is up to £150,000, or it was last time I checked. But that lists within its remit health economic, building health economic cases and modelling. I4I Challenge, I've just won a 2.2 million grant as a collaborator with a digital company who've got a digital platform for helping patients self-monitor blood diseases to reduce the burden on the NHS. And there are other collaborations that have led to funding as well, SBRI, Innovate UK. So there are lots of opportunities out there.
Okay, thank you. David Brettel, do you want to add anything?
Well, first of all, thank you to David. I'll follow up with you. That's very kind. Yeah, and I think also where we can help, of course, is partnering with the NHS. Always helps with bids for funding, and we find we add a lot of value, particularly with the clinical and patient input. And also one of the funding streams we have a lot of success with in the hospital is through Innovate, of course, Innovate UK, which is very well suited for us. So we're there to help as well with finding funding and networking with our colleagues around where the opportunities are.
Okay, so thank you. So we've run out of time, but thank you very much for giving those introductions into your areas. I think for those that have watched this and those that will watch the recorded version, I think it will help to clarify some of the misconceptions and the myths around methodology and clinical trials, health economics. And, at least it will also introduce the Leeds Innovation Pop-Up, because that's something that we definitely want people to make use of and utilize. And Surgical MIC will continue to send companies your way. And at least that means we're not shutting the door on people and saying we don't know who does that, and then that's the end of that story. We always want to sort of signpost people to places. But if anyone's interested in following up with any of the speakers, then obviously get in touch with the Surgical MIC. There's a Surgical MIC email address, and we can definitely set you up with the health economics or clinical trials. If you want to follow up with the innovation pop-up, as David Brettel said, if you go on Google, I've tried it myself, it does literally come up at the top. But if you can't find it, then contact the Surgical MIC once again, and we'll quite happily forward you and put you in contact with the innovation pop-up. So yeah, enjoy the rest of your day or any other roundtable sessions you might join later on. And after that, have a good weekend. And thank you to our speakers once again.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Thanks, Fee.
All right, bye.
Bye all.
Bye.
Bye.